the topic is family. How do we feel about family?
I've always been pretty close to my what?
Go ahead.
I've always been pretty close to my family. Like.
Marche, donc avant, arrière, et ça, c'est le petit pointeur. Alors ça nous permet de... D'accord, alors soit un pointeur, soit... Par contre, c'est uniquement sur le...
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Please. So, morning, everybody. So we are happy today to welcome Emmanuel Dupoux, who's going to talk about textless NLP. So, if I understood well, it will be a mix between NLP and speech this morning. So, Emmanuel, I'll let you the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm particularly glad to be here today, since the work I'm about to present has actually strong connections with the GSALT series. So if I can, does that work? I hope I will. Yes, I will try to get rid of this annoying message. There. Yes. Yeah, so basically I spent most of my academic career working on how infants learn language, but after a paper with Sanjeev in 2008, where we investigated the unsupervised learning of acoustic units, he relentlessly tried to convince me that it's very interesting to mix research in cognitive psychology, infant development, and machine learning and speech technology, and in particular to submit this project to GSALT. And so actually we tried for several times with various success, but there was one meeting which was a mini workshop in 2012 where for the first time we tried to put together these ideas of using inspiration from language acquisition to do some interesting speech technology in the zero resource space. And then in 2017 we had a full-blown GSALT workshop with some people who are here participated, and it was called the Speaking Rosetta Stone, and zooming on the idea of discovering linguistic units automatically. So what I'm going to present today is really a follow-up of this work. So what is textless NLP? Well, the starting point is that as we realize in these workshops, most of current language technology is basically based on text resources. So even speech technology is assuming that you have text, and the main task is to map speech into text, okay? And once you have text, then you do NLP stuff. So this is okay for languages that have a lot of resources, textual resources, but as you know, most of the languages in the world have few resources or no usable resources, and then they basically would be left behind if you wanted to apply this kind of approach. So, and that would be millions and millions of people. So the idea is to take inspiration from how humans learn native language. So we know that young children do not need any text at all to learn language. They learn directly by inspecting the sensory inputs they have, which contains mostly speech and also some contextual cues. And they learn at 4 years or 5 years of age before going to school. They perfectly have a workable dialogue system working. So could we replicate this automatically? Textless NLP is basically a new name for this old project that was there all this time. Okay, so there's actually a second reason to build textless NLP, even for languages that do have lots of resources. If you take like English, for instance, because even for adults immersed in text technology, spoken language is still the primary source of exchange and communication. And it's a problem because speech is not really quite text. In speech you have, in casual speech in particular, you don't have the same expression, you don't use the same vocabulary, And in addition, you have emphasis, intonation, non-verbals like laughters, yawn, and all kind of things that you put in your speech to express yourself, which is completely removed from text. When you do ASR, when you do transcription, you don't put this into your system, and so you can never, it's going to be very, very difficult to reproduce that automatically. So, basically, so this is just an example here from the Fisher dataset. I'm hoping I will be able to play this without screwing up everything.
The topic is our family. How do we feel about family? I've always been pretty close to my... What? Go ahead.
I've always been pretty close to my family. Like.
Okay. So what you can hear from that, it's a natural conversation over the phone in the Fisher dataset. And basically people in this dialogue, they spend a lot of time to try to coordinate each other. There is some silence, and then they sort of go back and they say, go ahead. So basically all this turn-taking negotiation is taking place, which is like typical of conversations, right? It's like the essence of what you do. You try to not talk over each other, and you have to coordinate your turns, and you use all these kind of linguistic and paralinguistic features to do that. Now, if you want to do something like this automatically, typically if you do, sorry. Damn it. I'm not used to so much to the Windows stuff. Okay, so now if you wanted to reproduce something like this automatically, you would take the Fisher dataset, you train an ASR system, then you train a language model on the transcribed speech, and then you do TTS. And the kind of dialogue that you generate with that would be something like this.
I'm fine, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you.
My name's Pat.
What state are you in?
Oklahoma.
And where at?
Oklahoma.
Oh, okay, I'm in Missouri.
Missouri.
Yeah, so what do you think about exercising on a regular basis?
Actually I don't do it very regularly. I mean I run like a half mile a day.
And I do pretty good.
Well that...
Okay, so this is trained on the Fisher. So on the Fisher, people actually spontaneously do repetitions. They repeat each other, they have like hesitate and go over what they said. But they do that in an intonation in a particular way that sounds natural. In this one, this is the Google API for TTS, and you can see that it really sounds stupid. And the type of thing is just not going to work. So that's what you can do. The best you can do with the current technology on reproducing, naturalistic dialogue. And so what we try to do in here, in the work with many colleagues across EHESS and Meta, is to generate dialogue directly from raw audio. And this is the sample from our base model. And then after that, I'm going to explain how we did it. Okay.
Yeah, it's just totally. I guess what doing about life involve had man surjanti the words.
Well, I'm talking in computer writing.
Yeah. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Quashina.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I used to school in the Middle East.
I'm from India.
Yeah. I used to have a fan all the time. What was your Coming American?
I'm pretty sure. I just pretty sure what I would doubt.
It's pretty shared, okay. I live in the earth side of North Korea. Where do you? This is our topic, too. This is a lot more shared also. I try to get up in any much. Okay. So I live in Transon area. Well, those are topic lists, the basics.
Oh, so they are coming up list there.
Yeah, I do. No, that's just over 19 teen from DA. And
okay, so I'm stopping there, so it continues forever. So you can see that it's very different from the other system. This one is able to capture the turn-taking, the timing, the laughter, the coordination in speech. It does not really capture much of the content, as you see. I mean, there's completely incoherent description of where the people live and not even answering the question correctly. So that's what we have. So we have now we have built a system like this, and we would like maybe at a later point to take the best of all worlds. But for a moment, let me try to explain how we did that. Okay. So this is a description of the text-based model I presented just before. You have these three components: ASR, then you have the TTS to reconstruct the speech, and then you have a language model that generates the text. And you can sample from it, and then you basically can generate a dialogue, even though it's actually a single language model, but you can simulate the turn taking by putting special tokens for speaker ID, and that's how you generate it. Okay, and as we saw, there was removing all the subtlety and expressivity of speech. Now, in the textless version, you keep the basic architecture, but you replace the text by a latent representation, discrete units that have been inferred automatically from the raw audio. And this is possible because of the recent progress in self-supervised learning systems that apply directly to audio and reconstruct some kind of units that we can call pseudo-text. Okay, and because they are discrete, then you can apply everything else. So because they are discrete, you can learn a language model on it, you can sample language model, and you can, from that, learn a TTS. But now, because they are unsupervised, they are going to contain laughter and all these kind of other things that are usually not transcribed. All right, now, the big problem is, in a lecture like this, is to learn it. Learning this architecture end-to-end is actually not tractable. It doesn't work. It fails miserably. So that's a problem. And the way in which people have dealt with that is to learn each of the boxes separately, which is probably not ideal. The second problem is how you evaluate a model like this, because now you don't have text, so you cannot have word error rate. You cannot have any of the metrics that are used usually. Okay, so these are the two things. And so the way in which to deal with the evaluation task is to define new tasks, okay? And that's what we have been doing in the Zero Resource Challenge for many years, is actually to take this architecture and say, well, assume that you don't have units that you can understand in the middle. How could you sort of define the task and define metrics that will tell you how good you are in this roadmap? And so the first two tasks, task 1 and task 2, first one is sometimes called acoustic unit discovery. Sometimes it's called audio representation learning. Then you have task 2, which is spoken term discovery. So these are about taking the speech and discovering some kind of discrete elements. Task 3 is about taking the speech, these discrete elements, and reconstructing the audio. So basically, it's a sort of a TTS without T. And then the other tasks are about language modeling. So spoken language modeling is basically language modeling from these unsupervised units, and task 5 is generative spoken language modeling. So for each of these tasks, we have defined over the years metrics, and these were submitted to challenges at Interspeech mostly over a number of different languages. So of course, it's like a very large amount of work. I'm not going to present all of that, but I'm going to give you some sort of basic ideas of what was found. So let's start with the encoder. So the aim of the encoder is to convert the audio waveform to a representation, which you can take as a sort of basically spectrogram, even though the dimensions may not be interpretable. Now, no matter how you extract this representation, you want it to encode linguistic information and discard non-linguistic information, like speaker, channel, etc. And so, how do we evaluate that? Well, as I said before, you don't have phonemes, so you can't do a phone error rate, but you can evaluate it with the same idea. So what you want this basically is to encode what's called linguistic contrast. You want that this representation allow you to make distinctions between things that are meaningful in a language, like distinction between bit and bet. And so the metric that we put together, which actually was, I think, came about in the 2012 JSOLT meeting, is called the ABX metric, where you present 3 tokens, bit, bet, and bit, by a different speaker, for instance, and you ask the last one to be closer to A than to B. And if it's yes, then yes, a positive answer. Okay, now, so how can we learn without supervision or text a good representation for the ABX task? Now, we cannot, of course, directly optimize the ABX score because we don't have the labels, of course. So again, there have been a number of different ideas, but the main ideas that has been very popular is to look at some notion of information compression. So if you look at the amount of information you need to encode a spectrum, like or MFCC representation, is going to be around 20 kilobits per second. if you now look at the same information you need to encode the same signal as text, is going to be very, very much compressed, so 200 times more compressed. So it's a gigantic amount of, what really phonemes are doing for you is removing massive amount of data, of information that's not relevant for language processing. So basically the idea is that if we could apply some compression technique to the audio, maybe we could achieve the same result. And so several models have been tried to achieve that form of compression. The first model here, it's a DPGMM. It's a form of soft clustering. You basically model your speech as a mixture of Gaussian, and then you represent now the speech as a series of posterior probabilities over these Gaussians. And there's also some autoencoder have been proposed. And up to 4 years ago, these were the best techniques that really win all of the challenges systematically. Very annoyingly, because it's actually such a simple idea. But so a rather new approach does not directly attempt to compress the information. So these new models are basically predictive models where you take some part of your speech and you try to predict a part that you don't see. So the model only sees, for instance, the past and try to predict future frames. This is a CPC model, and then the same idea is in Hubert and Wave2Vec, where you mask a particular section of your speech and you try to reconstruct what's missing given the context. And these models have been quite impressive at learning representations that are linguistically informative. And so they have really improved a lot on this ABX score, as you can see, starting from the MFCC with something like 20% error in ABX across speaker, down now to something like 4%. So that's quite good over the years. To give you an idea what it represents, 20% ABX score would be, imagine they have two categories. These are just like randomly sampled Gaussian in 2D, just to give you an example. But imagine that you don't have the colors, and how many clusters would there be? It would be very difficult to tell. But if you have a 5% ABX, then you can basically cluster by just looking at the data. So that's how good the models now are. This one is a Hubert model. Okay, now we have to go back to our goal, which is to learn a language model. So these representations are still continuous. So one simple idea to go to discrete is simply to cluster them, like apply k-means. And when you do that, you see the ABX score now, which used to be like 4%, now jumps to 8%. So it's really, you remove a lot, you sort of lose by doing this clustering. But you need to have discrete units for a language model. So there's no other thing. The other information the other thing you can see is that this is the number of units. This is the k in k-means. And so if you have too few units, it's not very good because you are starting to confuse phonemes. If you have too many units, then now you are splitting phonemes into too many parts. And that's why the score is going up again. So you have like a sort of good range of units between 100 and 500, which seems to be good. So we can also look at what these units are coding for. So what you do is you take a data set, which I think he was timid. I'm not completely sure about that. But so these are the units here. This is a heat map. And this is the phonemes force line. And you can see the correspondence between the units and the phonemes. And so by zooming on a particular phoneme, here the phoneme E, then you see that there are several units corresponding to the same phoneme. And vice versa, even if a unit has a particular, has a mode, then basically a given unit will have may have corresponds to several phonemes. So for instance, this one is just running to several phonemes. And another interesting thing is that there are some units devoted to non-speech. So this is actually corresponding to silence. And it means that there are different kinds of silences that are going to be clustered. And obviously, for the same reason, you also have all the non-verbals, laughter, etc. If they are in your training set, they are going to be represented by some units. Okay. Yeah, this is the heat map for 500 units, and it really looks very similar. It has the same property as 50 units. Okay, so another graph which is interesting to understand what these units are doing. So this is the duration of these units here, the histogram of duration in milliseconds. You see for how long they remain on compared to the histogram of durations of phonemes. And they really look different. So the phonemes are like sort of log normal in a duration around 70 or 80 milliseconds. And these units are much shorter and also don't really look like log normal at all. It actually doesn't improve with the quantity of speech. So if you increase the data set, it actually gets worse. The units get shorter, not longer. So we're not converging with phonemes at all. So maybe you have some hypotheses about that. What could that be? Actually, sometimes I speculate that it could be something like that. Okay, some of the good old phone states. But yeah.
If you go back to the duration graph for a second, the blue curve, do you know how it would change if you change the number of discrete units? Yeah. 50, 100, 500?
It's actually getting worse. If you have, they are getting shorter if you have more.
Okay, yeah. That's what I'm thinking, that it has to do with probably having the wrong number. Of course, I'm not sure what to think, because you don't necessarily want 1 unit per phoneme because you want to model acoustic variability of that phoneme, but yeah. So my speculation is that these units are too small, but it's a speculation, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is that when you try to make them larger, they are worse. Yeah. So we're stuck with these small units. Okay. But I think there's a lot of work to be done just understanding what these units are doing. Okay, so but now, since we have discrete representations, we can apply a language model on top of it. And here we simply plug an out-of-the-box LSTM or BERT or causal transformer to evaluate the results. We used here the 2 tasks from the zero source challenge, which are based on probability. So the syntactic task, you present a pair of sentences like they like, I don't know, hot dogs, and they likes hot dogs. And you compute the probability of that sentence. This is really a strange thing. The language model, and then you have a good score if the probability is higher for the syntactic versus non-syntactic sentence. And then the same thing for lexical. You can present either words or non-words. And the same idea is that if the model has implicitly extracted words, then it should give a higher probability to real words like brick rather than a non-existing word like blick that are otherwise matched in diagram probability. Okay, so that's the results here. And so you can see, so this is a curve I already showed before on ABX, and these are the curves for the spot the word, like brick versus blick. And as you can see, you have the same initial decrease, so when you don't have enough units, it's not very good, the performance is not very good. This is error, so the lower is better. But it doesn't go up, interestingly. So somehow, even if you have too many units, you have 1,000 units, which is way more than phonemes, somehow the LM manages to basically merge them into the same representation, which is interesting. In fact, when you probe the first projection layer of the language model with ABX, it's actually even better than that. So somehow the language model has learned the acoustic similarity between these tokens, and so doesn't suffer from a large number of tokens. And this is the score on the syntactic test, which is embarrassingly close to the chance level, and it doesn't seem to change much. So it's that's going to be our problem. I'm going to come back to that. Okay. Yeah, so this is actually, we put here the score on the same task, same kind of score with the text-based model trained on the same amount of text. And you can see, so the lexical score is really down, and the syntactic score is better, although not that great. But we know that language models require a large amount of data to be trained. Okay, Now let's move to the last component, the decoder. The aim of the decoder is to take the pseudo-text and generate a waveform. And so there have been a lot of papers doing this, either in the zero source challenge or outside of it. But the sort of the general main lesson from all this is that there is some kind of trade-off between the bit rate, that is the sort of the granularity of the units that you are using here. So you can have lots of units, small units, big units. So you can summarize that with bit rate, okay? And this is like the mean opinion score of the resynthesis using humans. And basically the trade-off is that, so where is the control? So the control is this is like an SR system, so SR plus TTS system, I think. Yeah, so you can basically get, no, so I think, yeah, I'm missing here in this graph the bit rate of the gold result. But basically, the trade-off means that you, if you have a high bit rate, you can have mean opinion scores that are even better than the standard TTS system. But if you want to match the bit rate of text, then you go actually under the performance of a text-based system. So this basically, that's the sort of the trade-off that we have to deal with. Now, what we did in this study is that we replaced the human opinion score by an ASR system, because it's like easier and we get the same kind of trade-offs between bit rate here and the phone error rate. So in this graph, lower is better. And so that means that if you have a larger number of units, this has changed, it's interesting. Then you, with more units and higher bit rate, you have a better performance in reconstruction. Okay. So now we can put everything together. We can train an autoregressive language model on top of the pseudo-text units, and we can sample from it to generate new audio or do a continuation of a prompt. And one other thing that's important in decoder language models is the issue of temperature. So because these are not text units, we had to play a little bit with the temperature to understand where the range where we could get something good. So this is like a very low temperature of the language model.
The Property by James Resselol, read for LibriVox.org by Jason Downey. The Property by Jason Downey. The Property, the Property, the Property, the Property.
Okay, so this is typical of low temperature, lots of repetitions. We actually get the LibriVox copyright that's been done by language model because it's very frequent. So all the things we know about language models are coming up there. And so if you have a high temperature.
But it is attendant from the people to defend himself from this information pride of the potential in criminal activity,
Okay, so this is like medium temperature.
Of pure blue. He said at once, licking stream, the utter wamspad hafper from node was a raging of sluve.
Yeah, so I think I mixed up the two labels. So the one on top is a high temperature. So in a high temperature, you have really a mixture of things. Not a lot of things are not even words. So you get words and a little bit of syntax in a medium temperature. So this is, so in order to deal with that, we developed a metric where we take into account, we basically vary the temperature and see the trade-off between the perplexity of the production and the diversity of the output. So I don't have time to get into that. But basically, I want to go back to this quantized representations there, because so far, basically, the Hubert units that I talked about are quite good to capture laughter and phoneme information, but we realized that it's not very good to capture other things that matter, like, for instance, F0, intonation. But it's easy enough in a representation like this to add F0. You just do another encoder, and you encode and quantize your F0, and you can actually feed that as a token, as a discrete token to a language model. And if you do that, then you are able then to build new speech-to-speech applications like emotion conversion. So we did that on a very small training set, which is called MOV. This is like emotions that are acted out, so they are not really convincing, but that gives you an idea of what you have here.
They were deep in the primeval forest.
So this is the input.
They were deep in the primeval forest.
So in this this is really like a translation system, right? You encode. You have a bunch of units which encode both the content and the F0, and then the language model is going to, in that case, is going to output a different. So it's a sequence-to-sequence model, not like this one. So it's basically going to edit that string and insert the laughter and change the F0 such that the output has the emotion. So that's the kind of thing you can do with these models. Of course, this is a hand-picked example, right? It's working very well. Yes.
In this case, does the language model have actually the freedom to also change the content and nonverbal, or is there like a hard separation between both?
It's a sequence to sequence, so the graph is not a good one. There's an input stream, language model, and an output stream. Oh, sorry, yeah, there's an input stream and output stream, and everything can be changed. Anything can be edited, replaced, substituted by the... It's quite a shallow language model, but still it can change also the content.
And then you could probe the disentanglement that happens in there, or?
Yeah, what do you mean by disentanglement?
Like the output of the language model. I mean, there are still two channels, right? Like one for content and one for F0.
For F0. Yeah. So they actually do the same thing. They are both basically. Since these two streams of F0, quantized F0 and content are fed to the decoder, which is just a hi-fi GAN, they really play different roles. So they remain like information about pitch and about content. Okay. So I lost the mouse again. Okay, so yeah, so basically I think I'm going to skip that. This is just more examples of generation, prompted and unprompted generation. You put a prompt and then you have a continuation. So the example, I mean, you can find these examples in this website, but you can prompt with something from a political essay or something from a novel from Jane Austen, and you get things that sort of match more or less the style. Of course, not the content. It's pretty meaningless. Okay. Now, this is not completely finished. So to fully model a dialogue, you have to take into account the fact that humans do not talk in absolute succession. They, as we say in the introduction, there is some overlap between speakers. So you have to basically model the whole thing as a dual channel situation where you have speech in both channels. Okay. Now, and of course, in this representation, you can define all these events like back channeling, overlap, gap, etc., as usual in analysis of dialogue. So to do that, what we do is we just clone the architecture we saw before. So we have now a pair of encoder-decoder that are share the same weights. Okay, so they are going to, each of them are going to encode one channel. So the channel left, channel right. They arrive at these strings of tokens, and then the language model is the same, is also cloned, but it has cross-attention. So now each, you can see that maybe more in this graph here. So this is the description of the transformer. So you have this transformer stack of transformer layers where you have self-attention, but you now also have cross-attention. So at each of the layers, the transformer can pay attention to what the other copy of the transformer is doing with its own input. And each of these two copies are trained to predict their own output. Okay? But what that means is that, for instance, when the speaker one is speaking, the other one is trying to predict when it's actually going to start to speak. So basically, given what it can sort of spy on the internal state of the other one, and say, well, maybe now it's time to speak, maybe it's now time to laugh at what the other is doing. Okay. And so once you have that, then what you can do is you can now generate conversations by doing a prompt. So you can prompt on the channel on the left by a 4-second prompt from a real human, and then you have a continuation of both channels. So.
Hi. Hi, my name is Dee. How are you?
Good. My name is...
So actually, so in this prompt, there was a ding. So the ding is the end of the prompt. And the prompt was the 2 channels. There were 2 voices. We heard that. And that's the continuation.
Debbie.
Debbie. Yeah. Where are you calling from?
North Carolina, and it's about the age before, or right up. Yeah, people on a vigilante care stand up. Yeah, but she has at least big talent here from the theater.
Okay, so you recognize the style. So it's a slightly spooky laughter still. But yeah, so you could imagine if you had a system that with low latency replacing one of the inputs by a real human. So you have a real human saying the things on the left, and the other would be generated by the model. So the model would just like be able, just without any change in architecture whatsoever. It will be a natural dialogue system. If you have a low latency of the whole thing, then you could really implement that. And it has just been trained with something like Fisher. Okay. Yeah. So this is analysis of distribution of the latency between turns. But I'm not going to have time to do that. I want to not like give the impression that everything is solved, because it's absolutely far from that. There are 3 major challenges to continue in this work. One is the noise and variability of audio that you can really use for training these kind of models. The other problem is the lack of meaningfulness of the generated audio. Which I think has to do with the fact that we are only dealing with very, very shorter than the phoneme units. And then the final thing is the lack of data. So, yeah. So this is this is from Chines 5. So it is really like, okay, you know about that. I don't need to to tell you that speech is noisy. I think, up to now we have been working with this LibriSpeech, LibriVox, LibriLite, whatever, read speech type of clean data. First of all, it's read in first place, so it's not really that natural. And second, it's recorded in the studio or very, very clean. So we need to build representations that would be invariant to changes. The other thing that we realize is that if you, we think that these Hubert units are sort of invariant, they are sort of phoneme-like, but in fact when you probe them, you discover that they encode other properties, like for instance, on the map, on the TSNE map on the bottom shows that basically half the units are coding male and the other one are coding female phonemes, which is a little bit annoying if you want to have like an invariant representation. And maybe there are other things there. So we also recently discovered that there's a problem of lack of context invariance. Okay, so this is a paper by Ewan Dunbar where he introduced these 2 novel versions of ABX. So on this one, typically what we have been doing so far with bet is basically keeping the context, the left and right context of a phoneme the same. So we have bit, okay, and that's what we do typically in the standard ABX. Now, in this version of ABX, you change the phonemes left and right. So now they are across context. And so on this graph, you have the ABX error rate, and this is the best model, Hubert. This is the spectrogram there on that, and they are intermediate models. And you can see there have been like quite a bit of improvement of the within context ABX across the years, but the across context has remained pretty flat. So that means that the units that we discover, maybe they are really like contextual triphones. They really are not invariant to position to left and right context, and that's a problem for learning, like for instance, words from it. The second problem, as I said before, is the lack of proper semantic processing. And on this slide here, there is a score on the task that we introduced in Zero Source Challenge Task 4, which is called a similarity measure. So what you do is you take a representation for a word, you pull it, and then you compute the cosine similarity between words like couch and sofa, and you compare it with couch and dog. And then you have humans giving the similarity between couch and sofa and couch and dog, and you compute the correlation. So this is correlation coefficient. It's really very, very close to 0. There's absolutely no progress whatsoever, depending on the size of the model and whatever. And these are the scores in text models. And you can see that if you have a text model based on phonemes or force-aligned phonemes, they are not very good either. It's only like BPE or word-based models that have a high score on that kind of metric, which shows that it's maybe the problem is that the units that we're dealing with are really too short. We need to have like bigger units in order to discover, word embeddings that would be meaningful, and so that would help having more meaningful outputs. So what we're lacking, I think, right now is the equivalent of a tokenizer in a language model. And this is actually problem task number 2 in the Zero Source Challenge. It's an early task, but it's actually not being solved at all. It's really very difficult to discover word size units automatically and use them in a language model. So I'm going to skip on that. I think I can just give you, so I think what at the essence of the problem is something that we have known for a long time in good old ASR, is that a word like 11, here there's a sketch about 11 on an elevator, where ASR doesn't recognize the words if you have a wrong accent. But even if you have the same accent, you can have a lot of different ways of saying the same word. This has been known for many years, and people were dealing with it with a pronunciation dictionary. Now we are doing things unsupervised. How do you discover an unsupervised dictionary even if you don't have phonemes? That's, I think, the core of the problem, and no one has really found a way to solve that yet. And that's, I think, what's blocking us in making a system that would reach semantic processing in that dialogue system. There have been a little bit of progress on the discovering words is one aspect, but then you have to be able to use that to segment your sentence into pieces. And the reason there is a difference between these two tasks is that you can process a sentence like, I've heard about I've read an interesting article about DAX in the morning paper. So DAX, you never heard DAX, but you can sort of segment it using the words that you know. So this task of segmentation has been basically staying around the baseline for many, many years. No one has really solved it. There are two recent contributions, one by Herman Kamper and one by Robin Algares in my lab, who had slightly better than chance. This is not chance, this is just a stupid baseline that segments every 150 milliseconds. And that's the segmentation F-score. This is the segmentation F-score you get with a text version of the same data. So there's a gigantic gap in the ability to segment things into meaningful units yet. The only slightly good piece of good news is that very recently, finishing his PhD, Robin found a way to boost the scores, segmentation score, by using some techniques of self-training. So it's quite interesting, but I think there's still a lot of progress to be made there. All right, so I think I'm almost there. So the final challenge, of course, is about data. So we know that language models really work when you have lots and lots of data. And in speech, there are a lot of obstacles to get the data. First of all, most of the speech data has been done in a RED by having people reading stuff, which is not very good if you want to have expressivity. Then you have other source of data, but it's difficult to get hold of them for legal reasons and things like this. So if we want to scale these things and do like the speech, the equivalent of GPT, but on audio, then we have to break this barrier. And so there is one interesting collaboration with CMU and Johns Hopkins with Meta, where the idea is to build an app that would do something like the Fisher data set, but at scale, like reaching 100,000 hours of speech or 1 million hours of speech. I mean, however, I mean that's what the order of magnitude of what we need if we want to do things that are comparable with text language models. All right, so I'm skipping all this, and because I think everybody getting a bit tired, so I want to thank the two teams of collaborators at the university and at Meta, who have over the years worked in this quite crazy but very interesting project. I also want to have special thanks to Sanjeev, who has relentlessly supported this kind of work. In fact, I think it was the previous GESOL, maybe the first one. I don't remember which GESOL meeting. Sanjeev said something like, well, thanks to this kind of work, we may someday be able to build an entire dialogue system from scratch from just raw audio. And they were a little bit of everybody froze in the and I said, wow, this is crazy. I didn't think we would be able to do that. But I think we are making small steps in this direction, and it's really thanks to your support, Sanjeev. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've always been very much interested in the zero speech work, and I guess it was important to hear Sanjeev's original motivation for it, because text is often difficult and misleading, particularly with regard to casual speech and non-standard speech. So to kind of remove the crutch of text where it's not necessary seems very important. But it's a little hard for me. I love the fluent nonsense clips that you play, but I just need a little help getting from there to where we ultimately want to be. If you could maybe help fill that in.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the sort of the sad answer is that, well, there are two sad answers, actually. One is sadder than the other. I mean, so the usual sad answer of machine learning is to get more data. And that's why I think focusing on trying to get like large chunks, basically doing the Libre speech of spontaneous speech is needed, because again, Libre speech is read speech, so it doesn't have, you can learn on it, but first of all, it's still not enough to get meaningful. And
what kind of markup would it need?
Well, you don't need, the nice thing is you don't need any markup. You just need lots and lots of audio. That's the nice thing about this unsupervised stuff. The only markup you need is for evaluation, is for the test. But the test set we have, what we are lacking is the training set. It's the large training set, spontaneous speech, good quality audio. So that's one answer. The other answer would be to start to mix. I mean, if you want to get to semantic level, you could start to mix with text. But I think it would be like, I think that's an obvious thing to try, and some of my colleagues at Meta are trying to mix text and speech training. It's actually much more difficult than was thought originally, because you want to keep the sort of laughter and expressivity. If you just do an ASR and do a language model, the outcome is what I showed at the beginning, so it's not working. So obviously, I would prefer to remain completely textless, but that's going to require a lot more data and also a lot more work on the models themselves, who are not good enough because they don't have the right sort of inductive biases to capture this. I think that working on the tokenizer would be one way to go. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask about how is there any plan to evaluate the prosody language models? Or of that, please?
Yeah, very good question. When we did this sort of prosody augmented paper, it was like, I mean, the emotion conversion was just one example of what you can do, but it's not really a good way to evaluate the prosody. I think what we need is a benchmark where we could see having encoded the prosody is changing something on the semantic level. Now, given these models are not very good at semantic, you have to do it some other way. So there are people who are doing applying this kind of textless work to doing speech translation. So I skip over that, but so it's called like direct speech-to-speech translation. You take one sentence in a language and you sort of translate it in the other language directly through speech, only using these discrete units. So in these kind of systems, you can imagine testing whether the prosody in the input, you can have two sentences that have only different prosody, have completely different meaning, and they would translate differently. So that would be one way to test. We are sort of trying to build a benchmark like that. Yeah.
Since I'm nice, I'm allowing myself to ask a question. So I'm just wondering, where are we heading to with that? I mean, what's the end goal here? Because it's nice to hear example, but what's the purpose?
What's the purpose?
Yeah.
Well, the ultimate purpose would be to have something like a GPT, a speech GPT. So if we were...
So it is basically building a dialogue system, speech-based dialogue system without text, right?
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
Get it.
Yeah, there was a question. Ken? Yeah.
This, I mean, I haven't been really watching this in a decade or so, but when we started, it was sort of in a different direction. The units you're looking at are, you know, pretty small, like phonemes, whereas I think the units we were looking at were like, you know, 3-4 syllables, something closer to a second or more. And when the units are that big, then you don't have to worry so much about prosody, at least that was the belief, and that you could find repetitions of things that are really quite large. And then you could do like information retrieval on a document without having any idea what things are about, right? And so it's interesting to see that you moved it towards really small units, where then you run into all the fundamental problems we were trying to avoid. And is there any interest these days in the larger units, things that are 4 syllables or so?
Yeah.
Because those are really much easier to find, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, that's this basically is the task 2, finding like word-like units.
This is much bigger than a word. I mean,
well,
4 syllables is like a phrase.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you know.
But then the question is I think the thing that happens with larger units is that they can no longer be discrete. Typically, when you have large units, if you start to cluster them, you are in trouble, because most of the large units only occur once in the text, right?
Well, that was, I mean, not an information retrieval. It would be the content phrases that, almost by construction, are repeated somewhere across the corpus.
Yeah, but to train the representation, you need to have like multiple. I mean, if you can do information retrieval. The question is, if you want to do language modeling on top of that, you need repetitions.
Yeah, well, you're going off in a completely different direction. All we were doing is saying we could find a lot of those matches, and the big matches were easier to find than the short matches.
Yeah, that's right.
That finding something that's sort of half a second or shorter is really tough. Once it gets to be on the order of a second, it's a piece of cake.
Yeah.
Right, when you've got a match. Now, you're saying they're going to be rare, but in a large corpus, there's going to be a lot of them.
Right. Yeah.
I kind of think the larger units are the direction to go, not these tiny things.
But I think information retrieval is one thing. It's really different from language modeling, and I think it's true that basically in the submissions that we had in the discovering word units, we had these like 2 different branches. Some people were trying to have like high recall. But then they achieve high recall with a tiny fraction of the data set. They can only have good recall for a very, very small proportion. They could, as you said, I mean, as soon as the words start to be smaller or the chunks start to be too small, it didn't work.
Yeah, that's why I say stop talking about words and think about seconds.
Right.
Okay, units that are around a second or so that are repeated are actually very easy to find. It's like the battleship game. The subs are hard to find. The big battle, you know, the aircraft carriers are easy. Go for the second or so. There's enough of those to do really good stuff, and it's very easy. Don't stay away from the hard thing. But anyway.
your talk. In some of the examples you showed in the very beginning, we could see that while the local context was well maintained on a global level, it wasn't very well maintained. For example, the change of where the person is from, for example. Do you think one reason could be that when we train for a text-based language model, we can encode much larger contexts in the model, and this you kind of hinted at with the information compression theory, but in a speech, or especially when you're training for raw audio, encoding such large global context can be very difficult. And if that's a problem, do you have any ways of how that can be solved?
Yeah, so it's true that if we have tiny units that are smaller than characters, obviously the context you can fit into the memory for transformer is going to be smaller. So that's one of the problems. But the other problem also is that if you try, and that's where people try to build larger units, like using BPE, for instance. But now, if you use BPE on the top of these small units, because these units are context dependent, you end up with an explosion of number of BPs for a given word. So basically, that doesn't work. That really fails. It's really sad. People have been trying to do that for many different teams. Try to do this aggregation of small units to get large units. Doesn't work. So you have to either completely get rid of quantization and work on big embeddings, continuous embeddings, and try to learn a language model from continuous embeddings. So that's one possibility. Or you have to find a way to do the clustering. But remember that in a word space or more than word space, basically half of your corpus is going to be made of hapax. So you can't really cluster hapax. You have to have like particular ways of dealing with the units that only occur once.
Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. I was trying to make some links with human learning of language, of course, and there is one or two interesting ideas. First, if you find units smaller, really smaller than phonemes, it's quite amazing, because we know for 7,000 languages in the world that phonemes are the smallest meaningful units. So, according to me, you are coding something else. That was my first thought. The second one is, you say that the segmentation at the end. Segmentation is the most important problem, which is exactly the case in human language also. And so I'm wondering to know if you are not coding the segmentation in your small units. So.
If
you need small units because the system is trying to code the segmentation and to find a solution to this problem thanks to increasing the number of units.
Well, I think the reason we are finding small units is that the acoustic signal contains small units. I mean, basically, when you have a phoneme, you say ba. Okay, you have pre-voicing, then you have an explosion, then you have transition in formants, and then you have the stable. So basically, you have different. Basically, a phoneme or a syllable in acoustic space is a succession of quite different acoustic events, and these systems are basically doing some kind of smart quantization of that space. This is very different from what we call phonemes, which are essentially articulations of targets. And so what's maybe one thing that's lacking in these models is an understanding of the articulatory system that generates these sounds. So maybe that's what the infants have that the systems don't. So infants, they can babble, they can do all these kind of things. So maybe that would help them to abstract away from this acoustic detail and go to the targets. And if you go to the targets, now you have phonemes. And the phonemes are also context independent, which is the other problem that we had. So that's one difference between, I think, the human and the machine. At least the direction has been done right now. And yeah.
And my second idea is also linked to human languages. In some cases, listening music before to do a training task is helping human infants to learn. So I was also wondering to know if you try to pre-train the system on music, on something else, before in order to learn the segmentation also of the rhythmic information, before to go to language.
That's a very good idea. We haven't tried music. We tried like non-speech sounds. And if you train your Hubert unit with non-speech sounds, you actually learn some things that help you. So you require less data to learn the acoustic space of phonemes. I mean, this sort of pseudo-phoneme units learn faster than if you train from scratch. We haven't tried music, so it's a good idea. This one back.
I was wondering if your end goal is making something like ChatGPT. Why do you need all this? You can just train a language model on waveform.
On what?
You can train a language model on waveform.
On waveform directly?
Yeah.
Well, that's basically what we are doing, but we are doing it with these intermediate steps of quantization.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Like, why do you lose information and try to recover? Why not just building it straight?
Well, I mean, language model has to. I mean, the language model that we know of are working on discrete units. So you need
but
some.
I mean, waveform is ultimately a discrete
right,
unit,
right? Yeah, you can do that. But I think it's good. It's not going to work at all. I mean, some people have tried other units than the Hubert. So Hubert units are quite abstract. In fact, I said they are like quasi-acoustic, but they are a little bit more abstract than that. If you go down, like you take this new like uncodec type units where you basically only do compression, but you can also compress music. So you have a discrete code that's doing way better than MP3, but so it's discrete, but it's way more compressed, but it's not specialized to speech. So you can train on that. And when you train a language model on that, so now you can directly generate laughter, generate music, generate anything. Right. But the language sounds like a complete garble. And probably it would work if you had like 100 times or 1,000 times more data.
It's just ultimately you said also you need 100 times more data.
Yeah, so it would be even another multiplicative factor on that. So instead of 1 million hours, you need 100 million hours. Which, yeah. But yeah, in principle, it should work. Yeah.
Thanks. We had a discussion yesterday, but just to add on that the results you showed with WAV2VEC2, for example, right, are worse compared to Hubert. Yeah. And why is that? Because the quantization happens right after, let's say, the CNN, so in a very low level. So the speaker information and all this information is still there, right? Whereas in Hubert, the discrete units are far more correlated to notions of phonemes and other linguistic features. Therefore, you can obviously try to do it in a waveform domain or something, but the problem is that it's not the level of granularity you want to focus on if you want to model the language, right? And that's the idea. Get rid of other nuisance variability, like speak information and so on, and focus on something that is more, let's say, linguistic, like phonemes or a triphone, right?
Yeah. Okay.